Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. It's September 30th, 2011. We're in New York City, and I have the honor and privilege to be interviewing Michael Conway for the Richard Nixon Oral History Program. Michael, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
Let's go back to Yale Law School.
Okay.
Tell me about some of your classmates who would later become important to the story of the inquiry.
Well, I was graduating in the class of 1973, which actually put me in the same class as my friends Bill Clinton and Hillary Rodham then, and Bob Reich, who was also a classmate of mine, and other people who ended up working on our staff, like Rufus Cormier. And we all sort of managed to graduate in the same class. Bill Clinton and I are the same age, but he spent 2 years in Oxford, and I spent 2 years in the U.S. Army in the middle of law school. And Hillary is a year younger, but she stayed around an extra year. So, and I met them in an organization called the Barristers Union that was essentially what you'd call a trial practice course today. But because it was Yale, we called it the Barristers Union.
Were you actually debated, or they were your adversaries?
Well, at the end, they were. What happened was it was a course requirement that you had to do something, a moot court, some kind of legal aid, or you could do this Barristers Union, and it was run by a board of third-year students. And your second year in the spring, I participated, and you had a trial with jurors who came in from the community, and because it was Yale, we got federal district judges from New York and Providence and Connecticut to sit in. And at the end of the term, they had something they called the prize trial, and people were selected, 2 on a team, and then there was a third that was sort of a support, but 2 active. And Bill and Hillary were my opponents in the prize trial. It was a criminal case. They were the prosecutors, and I was the defense lawyer. And it was tried on a Saturday in one of the big rooms in the law school, and Abe Fortas, who had just left the Supreme Court, was our presiding judge. And this was in the spring of 1972, and I'll tell you a little story about what happened later. So I've been friends and stayed in touch with the Clintons all my life and been active in their campaigns. And in 1972, Hillary came to where I live in the north suburbs of Chicago. She came to a town called Winnetka, which is next door to where I live. It's very Republican. And she came to make a campaign appearance before the Illinois primary. And so I introduced Hillary at this event, and there were probably 100, 150 people there. Hillary was a Democrat, I was a Democrat, and there was one other Democrat in the room that I remember, and she was sort of the grande dame of Democratic politics, and just a genteel older lady. So I introduced Hillary, and Hillary said, well, Mike didn't give him a complete introduction. He said, Mike and I were opponents in the prize trial at Yale, and Mike won. So after the concluded, and Hillary was fabulous and won a few converts, Dora, the grande dame, came up to me and said, in all earnestness, Mike, on your best day and Hillary's worst day, how could you be better than Hillary in anything? And I said, I have no idea. So that's sort of was the luck of the draw that day. But it put us together, most importantly, and related to what you're talking about, in the third year, because in the third year, there was a board that ran this, and I was on the board, Hillary was on the board, and Bill was on the board, and with some others. Rufus Cormier was on the board. And we had 2 prize trials again, one in the spring and one in the fall. And Bill and Hillary ran one of the prize trials. They organized the materials and oversaw it, and they selected a judge to preside at that prize trial, and that judge was John Doerr.
And that's how you met John Doerr?
That's how I met John Doerr.
By the way, that story about Winnetka, that's when Hillary Clinton was running for president?
No, that's when Bill was running. So this is way back in 1992, and she was campaigning separately for him, and it was in the just before the St. Patrick's Day primary in Illinois, the Illinois primary election.
Tell us about how you, the role that Burke Marshall played for you.
Well, Burke Marshall was a fabulous friend and professor and mentor at Yale Law School. I took several courses from him. And of course, Burke Marshall, as you know, and John Doerr were very close, and I think that's how John Doerr got asked to be and accepted to be the prize trial judge. But Burke Marshall is the reason I was on the impeachment inquiry staff, and feel like I'll tell you that
Please
story.
do.
So I went to college in Chicago, at Northwestern, and after law school I went back to Chicago to practice law, and I joined a law firm and begun past the bar in the fall, and it was January of 1974. And I was in my office and the telephone rang, and I pretty much remember this conversation pretty close to verbatim. It's, "Hi Mike, this is Professor Marshall." "Oh, hi Professor Marshall, how are you?" "I'm fine. Did you see that John Doerr was named special counsel of the House Judiciary Committee?" "Yes, I did." "How'd you like to work for John? Wouldn't that be fascinating? Goodbye." That was the conversation. And so shortly thereafter, I got a call from John Doerr, who I really didn't know very well. And John said, "Talk to Burke, see you Sunday." I said, "John, see me Sunday? This is on Thursday." I said, "I'm at this law firm. Mary, we're just buying a house. I've got 2 small children. I haven't spoken to my wife. I haven't talked to anybody at the law firm." He said, "Fine, call me back in an hour." So I went there were 3 senior partners, and I'm just a brand new associate lawyer, and went to one, and he was his politics were such that he told me to get back to my office and get to work. And I went to a second one who was the head of the trial department, and he wanted me to negotiate what my responsibilities would be and be sure I, was worth doing. And I went to the third one, who was a man who, at age 29 or 30, had worked in the Truman administration in a high position in the Internal Revenue Service, and I barely told him what had happened, and he said, "You have no choice, your country's called you to serve." So on Sunday I was in Washington working for John Doerr.
You might not have been able to say yes had you been clerking for a judge.
True. Happy to tell you that story if you like.
Please do.
Burke Marshall's integral to this story too. So it's very different today, but back in the late 60s and early 70s, U.S. Supreme Court justices took their clerks straight out of law school. And it's evolved now into a very elaborate process of feeder judges where young lawyers, able lawyers, clerk for usually Court of Appeals judges and then apply after that to the Supreme Court. But when I first began law school, I think 8 of the 19 clerkships in the U.S. Supreme Court were filled by Yale law students who graduated that year. But by the time it came around 5 years later with the Army intervening, in 1973, 8 of the 9 justices had gone to this system of having judges recommend their clerks and be a second level of clerkship. But Justice Byron White still had not done that. So I was fortunate to be invited down to interview with Justice White, and so was one of my classmates, Dick Blumenthal, who was head of the Law Journal and now senator from Connecticut. And we were interviewed, and tremendous experience, but we managed to put a nail in the coffin of that procedure because Justice White didn't offer either of us the job. So shortly thereafter, and I'd sent the letters off to the justices making the application, I got a letter from a judge on the D.C. Circuit. And since I guess my comment about him won't be too flattering, I won't say the name of the judge right now, but he said in his letter he had my resume forwarded by Chief Justice Berger, and he would be happy to offer me a clerkship. And if I clerked for him, that the chief might very well look favorably upon my application the next year. So I consulted, I didn't know the judge, and I consulted Burke Marshall, and he told me in a pretty plain language that the judge's politics were such that I might not be comfortable clerking for the judge. And so I wrote back a thank you for the kind offer, but said no. And the serendipity part is, had I accepted that clerkship, I would have been clerking in the D.C. Court of Appeals, and Burke Marshall couldn't have called me up and asked me to go be on the impeachment committee.
So you arrive in Washington, and what are your duties?
They were very fluid, I guess is the best way to say it. I'm sure it's been described to you many times, but we were in the old Congressional Hotel, which was literally a hotel, and we were on the second floor. And compared to the security that's so omnipresent today, it's sort of laughable. We had one guard at the second floor elevator. And I was initially assigned to investigate, sort of called the miscellaneous. It was the political tricksters, Donald Segretti and Anthony Ulasewicz and folks like that. But I was also then pretty quickly assigned to investigate the plumbers, and which had its own irony, because when we had in this converted hotel, we had a suite of offices, and we walked in and got a desk, and there were 3 desks in this larger room. There was a little alcove with a 4th desk, was kind of off to the side, and that was mine. And I thought, well, this is nice. I have a touch of privacy and so forth, and I'm going to investigate the plumbers. And then I realized that it was a converted hotel room, and I was in the bathroom.
That is appropriate.
So I began doing the plumbers, but what actually happened was, as the work progressed, as the investigation focused more on key things and less on peripheral things, I sort of followed the investigation. So went from the plumbers to the Watergate and Watergate cover-up. And that's sort of the progression I had over the 8 months I was doing this.
Everyone I've talked to so far stresses that Mr. Dorr stressed to you how important it was to be nonpartisan.
Absolutely. I wasn't, you have to put yourself back in those times, but I wasn't particularly politically active. I was what you probably would call a moderate or conservative Democrat, and I had no disposition or opinion about Watergate at all. As a matter of fact, I hadn't even followed it that closely. My wife watched all the Senate hearings the summer before when I was studying for the bar exam, and I didn't really follow it that much.
You were in the Army?
I was in the Army from 1969 to 1971.
Did you go to Vietnam?
I did not go to Vietnam. My brother went to Vietnam. I was trained to be a combat engineer, and in the wisdom of the Army, when I was sent to a combat engineer unit, they made me the company clerk. So I protected America from Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
When you arrived, the materials you were using came from the Senate Watergate?
Largely. I mean, in a way, to talk about it being an investigation is a little bit of a misnomer. It was more an effort to review and accumulate existing materials. And so the largest source was from the Senate's Select Committee of the prior year, but there were other materials that were available, and essentially, and I'm sure you've heard about the card catalog system at great length, but essentially we were to discern specific facts and identify facts, and that was the very meticulous and slow, in some sense tedious process that we went through. And so the first place to look before we went anywhere on our own was to really review, in this context of the impeachment inquiry, what those facts said, because the earlier investigations were broad-based, but they weren't focused necessarily on the president.
In this early period, were you working with Hillary at all?
No, Hillary was a little bit cloistered. Hillary was given the assignment of doing the research into the standards for what was an impeachable offense. And so she was sort of the scholar with, I think, 1 or 2 other folks. And we were in the fact side of it. So, though we're all on the same floor, one aspect of this that it's really hard to overstate is the kind of compartmentalization process of this. Not only did John Doerr stress nonpartisanship, he really had a need-to-know mentality. And if it wasn't something you needed to know, it wasn't part of what you were looking into, then it wasn't shared with you. And so in a way, I think as you'll find talking to various participants, at least at the earliest stages, everybody knew something about a particular area, but they really didn't have the overview that John and perhaps Dick Cates and Bernie Nussbaum, Bob Sack, and Evan Davis might have known. But I was a foot soldier.
What role did you play in assembling the statements of information?
Well, we essentially went through these documents, and we would try to identify things that we thought were salient facts. And of course, there were a lot of gaps we didn't know. And we early on, when we got the president's daily schedule, and we would look at information that we had from other sources. We did have, in addition to the public information that was in the Senate Select Committee, we did have the testimony they'd taken in private or in camera sessions. So we'd essentially find a fact, would fill out a 3x5 card, and the library would essentially develop these things initially in chronological order. John Doerr's belief was, and it proved out, it would be very powerful just to say in a sort of without adjectives, step by step by step what occurred. And frequently in this time period you would have somebody's testimony about an event, and then two White House people talking, and then the person who talked didn't meet with the president, but the next one the president's calendar would show a meeting, and then there'd be something on the other side of it. You wouldn't know, you were kind of trying to connect the dots and infer what happened in between there, and of course that's what led to the requests for tapes and the subpoenas.
You had a personal role in accepting the grand jury information.
Later on, what happened was when the so-called Black Satchel came, and as I said, my role evolved, and either I was someone who wasn't good at anything and they kept trying to change me around, or I was the utility infielder or whatever. But when the grand jury satchel came, then, which was locked in a safe, John Doerr gave me the responsibility of sort of being the keeper of that, and again, in this need-to-know process, giving information to specific people who had a need to know that information.
So tell us what you remember from what was in the satchel.
Well, those are the first tapes that we've gotten, and the taping system. It's hard to believe that this is in a lifetime that these events occurred, because so many things are different. I mean, the technology we had no technology, and the tapes themselves were very, very difficult to understand and hear. And there was, what was then considered state of the art to try to make the fidelity of those better. And sort of jump ahead, I was actually had the good fortune to be in the first session of the committee, which was a private session where the members heard the tapes. And they had these big bulky earphones. The first, and I can't say what the interval was, I'm thinking a minute, but it probably could have been shorter and just seemed longer. They played the tape in their I guess in their original version, I should say. It was impossible to hear. There was static, it was noisy, it was almost felt like if you listened very long you'd get a headache. And then it began playing with the background noise removed, the voices enhanced, and the members were transfixed, every one of them. It was like all of a sudden you could really, because the tapes came with a lot of pre-publicity, and you could tell when they first heard them, they thought, these are the tapes, we can't make out anything in this. And then you were almost a voyeur listening in on these conversations. I had nothing to do with the technical part of it, but the people who worked on that did that, and it made a tremendous impact. And of course, every time the tapes were played, had a tremendous impact.
We've talked on camera with some of the members who were there. Do you remember and they've discussed the impact on them of hearing the tapes, the cleaned up version,
right,
the first time? What was the effect on you of hearing the tapes?
Well, there's such powerful evidence. I mean, in almost every instance, and I think of one, and I can't tell you the date of it that was different, and maybe I'll tell you that. But in every instance, the information was far more powerful and incriminating hearing it than reading it, even if you had an absolutely accurate transcript. It was the way conversations occurred, it was the interjection, it was the tone, and it was just much more powerful. And there was never any doubt that what you were listening to was accurate. It wasn't a transcript, it was a transcribed probably. The one I remember, and this, I've got to confess that maybe my storytelling over the years has gilded this story, and if it did, I'm sure it can be found out. But I do remember looking at a transcript where in the White House where the president and his advisors were there, and there was talk about making payments to people to be quiet. And someone said, after some particularly incriminating statement, watch out, Mr. President, you'll be hurt. And he said, no, I can take care of myself. It looked terrible on the printed page. But they don't actually heard that tape. Everything that was said was, of course, said. But someone was moving around the room, presumably the president, and knocked something over with a large clatter. And someone said, watch out, Mr. President, you'll be hurt. And I said, I can take care of myself. So that was the only example where it was more benign to hear the tape. But 99 times out of 100, the tapes were much more powerful and actually incriminating.
Tell us what you can remember of how the case developed. Well, first of all, your inquiry went from being an inquiry to ultimately being a prosecution. That was, in the end, even Mr. Dorr had to make a case. But it
was a presentation. I think if we had gone to the Senate side, it would have been a prosecution. John Dorr's philosophy was to let the facts speak for themselves, and to develop the facts, to develop in a way that couldn't really be challenged in terms of their accuracy, and there really was no effort to spin the facts. I mean, you laid the facts together and they portrayed a picture. So, but I think what actually happened, maybe to answer your question a little more directly, is the staff over the period of, I began in late January. Over the period of January till April or May, I think the staff largely became convinced that the president had done something that was an impeachable offense. Was it a crime? Probably was a crime too, but the standard was it didn't have to be a crime. But that was sort of done in an incubator. I mean, I can't tell you how insular we were from the world. And so we arrived at that conclusion, and then the next stage was presenting that same evidence to the committee, where the committee arrived at that conclusion. But I mean, in this day and age of instant information, I remember, and perhaps Maureen Barton told you about it because she was our librarian, the information was so tightly held and so lacking that I remember the Washington Post one day running a story about some work at the building to reinforce the floor under our library, and from that to deduce how much evidence we had. I mean, which was, you kind of scratch your head, but that was how tight the information was. And so we really didn't discuss this elsewhere. And we were living in a very insular world. People worked 7 days a week. Same people were together every day. And it wasn't like you go out on the weekend and talk to other people about this. And of course, John drilled into us the importance of confidentiality, which is, I suppose, one reason why, almost 40 years later, people are finally, feeling free to talk about these things, because that was the mantra we lived by.
And Mr. Dorr expected you to be at your desk at 8 in the morning.
Expected us to be at our desk at 8 in the morning. It was a funny work schedule. I think we would probably be in trouble with the Labor Department, but everybody was, salaried. I made the lofty sum of $19,000 a year, and we worked 7 days a week. The difference you could tell was Monday through Friday people wore coats and ties and worked till all hours, and I remember with no sense of irony or sarcasm or joking someone asking me about 11 o'clock at night if I was going to go home or work late. And then on Saturday or Sunday, we only worked probably 8 or 10 hours, but we wore jeans and casual clothes, although we saw no one ever. So it was, but you may be alluding to is that that's fine for the lawyers and even for the professional staff. We had secretaries who were just employees of Congress and who were brought there, and they were devoted and they worked all hours, and there were times that they worked till 2 or 3 in the morning typing on an electric typewriter because there were no computers. And then John would come by at 8 o'clock in the morning and wonder where people were, and I'd say, John, they were here till late at night. They'll be here pretty soon. And once I said that, he understood.
The minority suggested some members of the staff. There sort of was a minority staff. How close? I mean, at what point was there a dividing line between minority and majority, or did that disappear over time?
It disappeared for some people. It didn't disappear for everybody. There were people on the minority staff who were as dedicated, committed, even zealous as members of the majority. Of course, Bill Weld was a member of the staff. Steve Sharp, who later became an FCC commissioner, was a Republican member of the staff. Burt Jenner set a very bipartisan tone as the minority leader. There were other members of the minority staff, some of whom had been staffers on congressional committees beforehand, because this staff was pulled together from a variety of sources, treated it like a 9-to-5 job, and they went home at 5 o'clock. They were, certainly in the minority of the folks who worked on the staff, but there were people like that too. But I think that there wasn't really a partisan hostility in the same sense that we see today. I don't think that was present at all. And while the minority and eventually Sam Garrison sort of became the more active minority counsel, because Burt Jenner was viewed as by some members of the committee as being not representing the minority staff's point of view, or the minority members' point of view.
When you were hired, did you know how long you were going to be staying in Washington?
No, actually, I you know what I did? I did find one note. This is a trial lawyer's problem. In hindsight, I wish I kept a diary, but of course, I know from litigation that I'd subpoena your diary and there it goes, So I never kept a diary, but I found a note which I actually brought with me, which I think was perhaps the notes I made when I got John Doerr's call. But I dare say it's for unlimited duration. That's what it said.
Before the committee took its votes, did you have a sense that there would be a bipartisan majority in favor of at least one article?
I did. There were a number of Republican members who were very involved, who, from everything I could see, and I wasn't personally close to any of them, really agonizing over some of this information as it came forward. And I know it was entirely the desire of the chairman and John Doerr that this be a bipartisan. If this had been a party line vote, it would have been a failure of the whole mission, because the mission was to conduct this in a bipartisan way and to lay the facts out. And if it had been a party line vote, either way, I mean, I think that we believed that the president had committed impeachable offenses by the time the committee heard this, and we would have been expecting that there'd be bipartisan support for the articles. But if the proof had turned out differently, we would have wanted bipartisan support against the articles if they'd been offered. And of course, as you know, some of the articles were voted down. So there were issues that were very important to some members, Cambodia, the emoluments and so forth, and there's some that just dropped by the wayside along the way, and those were voted down. So I think it was critical, and the whole process of bringing the members along first in, I guess I should have made the stages clearer. We had the staff learning the information, and I think becoming convinced of an impeachable offense. We had the members in executive session hearing the information. And of course, they also heard witnesses. And then by the time the public session where the votes occurred, I think, I'm not saying every member made up his or her mind, but they were well on their way to making up their mind.
When the committee heard the tapes the first time, that was an executive session.
Correct.
I asked you about your reaction. Can you give us a word picture about their reaction?
It was, they were startled, I think is the right way to say it, because there had been such a buildup from the time that Alexander Butterfield had disclosed them a year earlier. This is a year. They've heard about the tapes for a year. They've had the president give us the edited transcripts before they heard the tapes. So there's been this tremendous buildup for it. It's like, you know, a new movie coming out. There's a lot of hype about this. Everyone knew what the tapes were, and were they things that really could be understood, because the taping system was described as being pretty crude, and it was pretty crude. And so I think it just had a powerful impact. Every time tapes were played, they just had a disproportionate impact, even though we prepared transcripts of the tapes and the like. So, the $64 question is, why did the president keep the tapes? But once he did keep the tapes, they were the damning evidence.
Once the 3 articles were approved, what did you think you'd be doing next?
Well, I'm going to take a step back, because I actually, was in the committee room when they were approved, and of course the room was packed. It was being televised, and there was kind of a corner entrance where the members could come in off the side, and I was standing there. So I'm really in the corner of this huge room. And when that vote occurred, I mean, people talk about an electric atmosphere. It's hard to capture. You really can't describe it in words. That there was tension, there was excitement. It was a culmination of what we'd done, but it was much more than that. And the chairman presided in a very deliberate, solemn way. The members were asked in a very slow way to vote. The votes weren't necessarily known in advance, and it was just a compelling, dramatic moment. But anyway, I answered a different question. But
no, that's an even more important question.
But the first thing I did was, and I said that my role was pretty fluid, and my degree was in journalism. I was a newspaper reporter for summer at the Chicago Sun-Times, and was editor of the Daily Northwestern. And so as my wife says now, I used to be able to write, but I've been a lawyer too long. And so one of my jobs was to be kind of an editor of the final report. Obviously, John Doerr was the editor, but I was helping him and reading comments and getting input from people. And so what I did immediately was work on the final report. Now, in the midst of this, of course, we have the Supreme Court decision in U.S. versus Nixon, and we have the release of the tape. So the report's being written, and then things are happening in the process. I had been asked to stay on and be part of the prosecution, if you will, if it had gone to the Senate. That would have been a tremendous experience. I had a wife that I saw very periodically, and a 2-year-old and a less than 1-year-old that I saw even less. So it would have been a little bit of a hardship, but my wife was so good about these things, still married to her after 43 years, that I think I would have stayed. And I think that's what I thought I was going to be doing until the President decided that he would resign instead.
A question about the final report before we discuss the President's resignation. Who was the audience for the final report?
There were many audiences for the final report. One audience, the obvious audience, is Congress. We were writing the committee's report, recommending the committee's vote on impeachment to the members. And at the time we were writing the report, certainly believed there would be a vote of the Congress on this. Because there were dissenters from the report, there were people who had voted against the articles, and so this was designed to make a persuasive case of the evidence that had led the committee to vote the articles of impeachment. So that's one audience. Second audience is the public, the citizenry. In a very transparent way, the evidence had been shown in these televised hearings. There was tremendous interest, and these hearings were being broadcast. This is before all the channels specializing in court TV and all this. They were being broadcast on the major channels. And one was really to show that this was a factual inquiry, that there were facts based on this, and it wasn't a political decision. I think a third audience is history. It's easy to forget. People, everything's now Watergate and something gate. Every scandal that comes on is a gate, and the word is in the lexicon is maybe doesn't relate to actually what happened. And so I think it was to collect and marshal that evidence. And then, of course, what happened was that many of the members who had voted against the articles of impeachment after the Supreme Court ordered the release of some of the tapes that we've been after for so long, and they were released and their content known, a number of those members rethought their position. And so at the end of the report, there are additional and supplemental reports by various members. They didn't change their mind on all three articles, but many of them changed their mind on the principal article. And so, in part, it was a very fluid document. The report we were writing changed because of the subsequent events.
You must have written that report very quickly.
There was a lot of fast writing going on there. Now, work was being done all along because a lot of the report, really, if you read it, and I actually pulled it off a bookshelf and looked at it within the last 24 hours, is this, again, what you might say very dry, factual recitation of the sequence of events. Footnoted, documented, and so forth. So, in a way, we were writing the report from day one when we were making the 3x5 cards. Now, it had to be pulled together. It had to be put in some context. But a lot of the information was already there. And you've probably seen them. I've got them in my basement. They look very dated. They look like a Formica counter from the 1950s. But the actual statement of evidence, statement of facts, were these big black binders with this garish orange divider paper after each statement. And there'd be a statement, and then there'd be an excerpt of a deposition or an excerpt of testimony or a transcript from the White House tapes. And so that information got published by the government printing office into a nice book, but that information was always there. One of the things, I'm going to come back to how the information was compiled. In a sense, we were prodded by some of the members, Republican members of the committee. A couple weeks earlier, there was a hearing where some Republican members said, in effect, where are the specifics? Where are the specifics of this? You say these things, the president, where are the specifics? And I remember a late night, if not all night session of people on the staff writing paragraphs, each of which began with the word specifically. Specifically on such and such a date. And then the next day, those comments were distributed to members. And when someone say, where are the specifics, each member had 10 or 20 paragraphs, and they read these things.
So those were in addition to the statements of information. This was sort of added. An added
well, it was
memorandum?
added or took statements of information and kind of highlighted it, because the notion was you're making these charges, but they're amorphous, they're general, they're obstructing, and where are the specifics? And so a lot of them came from the statement of facts, but they were sort of repackaged, and everyone began with the word specifically. And that was a writing project that got done overnight one night.
To actually redo, so So in a sense, the statement of information that was to be handed out the next day was rewritten.
Well, or some of it actually happened, but it was essentially, they didn't change the statement of information. Those existed pristine as they were, but the members were sort of giving, I guess, what you would call today talking points.
Did you participate, were you involved at all in the discussion over issuing the subpoena?
Yes. Again, because I'm sort of like, who's the Woody Allen character who's just in the background? Yeah, Zelig. I'm Zelig of the committee, I think. But I remember very much sitting around with Bob Sack and Bernie Nussbaum. You can ask Bernie when you talk to him. We'd have the president's calendar, and we'd have John Dean saying he did something, he left the White House, and then a meeting with the president, and then Haldeman or Ehrlichman would show up, and then something else, and he'd talk to Haldeman or Ehrlichman. So we went through these things, and we tried to identify, well, they must be talking about Watergate here. So we want to issue. So we issued the subpoenas, which of course the White House ignored. But then the special prosecutor took our subpoena and made it, not totally, but many incorporated into the special prosecutor's subpoenas, which commanded more respect, attention from the White House. And when the June 23rd, some of these conversations came out later in the White House, you know, our initial reaction was, boy, were we smart. We figured out exactly that this was the meeting they're talking about, something that was germane to Watergate. Then after time passed and more of the tapes were made public, we sort of in hindsight thought, we weren't smart. We could have thrown a dart. They were talking about this all the time. If you had a meeting with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, the president, at a certain time, they were talking about this. So in a way, we did identify some of the key ones, and of course, we never got the tapes directly, except we got them through the special prosecutor subpoena. I remember, and I said I was trying to check myself. I remember an evening session, and it was after the president had released the so-called deleted or edited tapes. And again, this shows something that could be done in a law firm in an hour in the afternoon, or PowerPoints or something, but the idea was to visually display, John had the idea to visually display what we had gotten and what we hadn't gotten. So I was given the job of having created a big board for the committee room, a big rectangular board, and the board was simplistic in the extreme. It listed the various dates of conversations that we had subpoenaed. And then it listed a column that said notes and memorandum and tapes and transcripts, and I've forgotten them all, but it was like just a grid. And the board was all white, and then we filled in, and I went up to some Photoshop or something in Washington. I don't know where I went to get this board made. And we filled in red what we'd gotten, but of course what we gotten was very little. We got no tapes, we got no notes, and we just gotten these edited transcripts. So the area of the board was largely white, which we hadn't gotten, in a little red column what we had gotten in. So we had an easel, and we brought that into the committee room, and we put the board up, and the staff or someone alerted the Republican members that this board was out there, and of course the hearing was going to be televised, and the word came back that they weren't going to come until this board was removed. So the board was duly removed, but my memory is, and I'd have to go back and look, that it was on the front page of one of the big newspapers the next day, this picture of this board, which it could have been made by a fourth grader with modern art skills.
It was in the room, but they weren't there.
They weren't there. It was set up in the room ahead of time to explain, yes. Because one of the issues, of course, to the committee was the White House wasn't complying with our subpoenas. So this was a little graphic to do that. And as crude as it was, the graphic was too pointed for some people, and they didn't want to come in until it got removed.
Can you recall whether the committee listened to the tapes before or after the White House issued its edited transcripts?
Oh, I'm sure it was after. I'm sure it was after because, because of course the minute I say I'm sure, I'll probably doubt myself. But I believe it was because there was a big issue about the edited tapes, and by the time that was presented, we had our tapes and we'd done our transcripts and could compare. And one of the issues in the report are the discrepancies or the mistranslations between the edited tapes and not.
Because your staff,
Have I done something wrong here? Oh, thanks.
did you?
More disheveled than usual.
Bec- Because the staff had listened to the tapes before the edited transcripts.
Right, and we were able to, well, not everyone in the staff.
Not everyone, but I mean, you had a special group.
Very limited group.
Very limited group.
And so, in many senses, we were hearing the tapes, many of us, when the committee heard the tapes.
Had you heard them before?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Did you finish your draft of the final report before the president resigned?
I don't think so entirely. My memory, because I remember working on it afterward, and I do have this vivid memory of the night he resigned. We were in our offices working, had a television. I'm sure it wasn't a fancy television, and we had all these deadlines, and we had to get our report out, and tremendous urgency and pressure. And then the president came on and said he resigned. And it was just like, you know, the game ended in overtime. I mean, it just ended. All of a sudden, everything that was crucial, pressing, important, wasn't crucial, pressing, and important. So I remember people just, and it wasn't like a large group, it was a small group of us that were watching, at least on this television set. And I remember we just sort of left for the day. And I said my wife and children, we had a rented apartment in Roslyn, just over the Key Bridge. And I used to come to work back and forth by taking the bus. And there was a bus that went from Key Bridge and went down Pennsylvania Avenue, actually past the White House, and came up the hill on the Senate side. And I became very used to the bus schedule and knew the last bus at night. So that night, after the president resigned, I got on the bus to go home. And it was, I don't know what, early evening, I can't remember the exact time, 8 o'clock or so, or 9. And there were 2 or 3 people on the bus. The bus driver was listening to the baseball game on the radio, some kind of radio he had. And we came up Pennsylvania Avenue, went right past the White House. The lights were ablaze. There were no people there. It was calm and serene. Nobody was agitated. And I thought, we just changed who the President of the United States is. And it was reassuring in a way. It was reassuring, and you know, the bus went out and I went home. But really, events that had never happened in our country occurred, and you couldn't have told from what you saw at the White House. It was, and you know, there was some concern early on, you know, and probably totally unjustified, but early on in the first weeks or months of this thing, you know, envisioning showing up to work someday and having some law enforcement person say, no, this is closed. You know, and you go home. And so against that setting of, and I'm sure that was paranoia or exaggeration or whatever it might have been, because nothing like that ever happened. But to have such tumultuous things happen and have the world around you not be in tumult was just striking to me.
Must have been strange working on the final report after the president resigned.
It was. You know, some people I think pretty quickly left. I stayed till the end of August, because I remember kind of Labor Day going back home. But at that point, and we had the members supplementing their remarks, and of course they got to write what they wanted. We weren't editing what the members said. So at that point, you really knew you were writing pretty much a historical document, because it would never be acted on.
What did you think of the pardon?
I think it was probably the right thing to do. It's hard to know. In a way, you'd say, well, he did these things, and he should be held accountable. There was a system of laws, but he was held accountable. And it would have been a very, very difficult time to have had any kind of criminal trial or criminal proceeding.
You finished the final report before the pardon. Did you think that the final report would play some role in his trial?
Certainly the evidence, but we didn't really, we did interview witnesses, we did do a few things, but we really didn't gather a tremendous amount of evidence. So, the report was more of maybe a roadmap of what happened. And of course, you still would have the issue about, whether that conduct was criminal, because our point was you didn't have to establish criminal culpability to have him not be faithfully executing the laws. So it wasn't like the prosecutor could have put our report on the table and said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please find the defendant guilty. There'd be a lot more to it. So what we were doing was more amalgamating and organizing the evidence than it was really investigating the evidence.
Do you remember the debate over whether Mr. St. Clair could cross-examine?
Well, I again played a little trivial role in this. You may remember person, Judge Matt Byrne, who was the judge over the Ellsberg trial. And in my meandering of responsibility and having something to do with the plumbers, I can remember being given the assignment to take his deposition. But then the word came out that we were taking a deposition not in the sense you would in the courthouse where other lawyer got to be. We were going to take his statement or deposition without Mr. St. Clair there. And that raised a ruckus, and so we didn't. And so I remember it from that point of view early on. And then later on he was involved in the actual hearings itself, but that was a kind of a precursor to it.
Was Mr. St. Clair, there were some sort of interviews that the committee did where he was not?
Well, yeah, but I think this was more in the nature of, well, people would come in and talk to us, but I think we were actually going to try to take a formal deposition.
Under oath? Yeah,
under oath of the judge. And the potential offer to be the FBI director. I'm pretty sure it didn't happen. I remember the assignment, and I remember thinking, okay, I've done something else to cause a confrontation here, so I might board in my deposition, I guess.
Tell me, did you have occasion to talk to Mr. Marshall, Burke Marshall, during the period that you were on staff?
I didn't really. He came down, I think, to visit. I will tell you, my wife will say I didn't talk to her. And I don't remember doing that. We were very, very insular. It's the only way I can describe it. And so we talked with one another.
Did you ever talk to him afterwards?
I did.
About this?
I did. And, it was a tremendous experience. I mean, you know the history of Burke Marshall and John Doerr, and I actually had the good fortune to work with John Doerr afterward, too. But really, the sort of tenor of Burke Marshall and John Doerr, that kind of even, steady, professional attitude just permeated everything. I don't remember, I'm sure I thanked him for the opportunity to have done this, because I was 26 years old.
What did you do with John Doerr afterwards?
We actually had a little lawsuit together in Illinois. We were co-counsel on a lawsuit. Nothing that made any big waves of publicity, but it was just fun to see him again and work with him again. He brought I was born in Missouri and went to Yale to law school, but came back. I'm a Midwesterner. John's a Midwesterner, and sort of share some of his sensibilities, although I'm not as stoic and quiet as he is. But
are there any other stories you'd like to preserve? from this experience?
I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes, maybe.
Go ahead, please.
If you're a reader of Catch-22, you remember Major Major. Well, our staff had a Marshall, Ben Marshall, or Marshall Marshall. And Ben Marshall was given the task of serving the committee's subpoena on the White House. And he was a very nice man, but by the books. And the joke was that he didn't really do this, but the joke was that he would appear to the White House, be invited in and said, "I have a subpoena, which one of you is Mr. Nixon?" But he didn't do that. The other story is a fellow named Lee Dale was in our little suite where I was in the bathroom. And Lee's job was to look into the CIA's involvement. And we had these, we each had a telephone on our desk, and so if the telephone rang, we all knew, got a call. And Lee had a peculiar experience. He would deal with whoever's contact was the CIA for information, would request information. They'd give us information. This was all they had. Then usually on a Monday, after Senator Baker had been on a talk show on Sunday talking about CIA's involvement, Lee would get an unprompted call. And someone at the CIA, they just happened to look in another desk that it had not been searched, and they found some more documents. And some more documents would come in that would be incriminating of the White House. And that's all they had. And then this occurred repeatedly. So it became a little bit of a standing joke to see on Monday morning whether Lee would get a phone call. And he did a few times.
Michael, thank you very much for your time. It's been wonderful.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for undertaking this. And certainly as the youngest, I'm really gratified that some of the thoughts of my colleagues are going to be preserved too, and mine too, since I'm not that young anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.